Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review The Conjuring 2. So, I had gone through and wanted to watch every single Conjuring universe movie, but I decided that I'm like, you know what? Life is short. I ended up trying to watch The Curse of La Llorona, or whatever the the one was in order before this one, and I'm like, I can't watch this movie. I started to watch it and I gave up. And so really I just wanted to just watch The Conjuring 2 because it's like I'll be able to just watch this and watch the other Conjuring movie and that'll be it so far. And plus, it also seems out of most of these Conjuring universe movies, it seems like usually the only ones usually worth watching are the Conjuring movies. Everything else, straight up garbage. But, like, this movie has to be probably hands down so far, because I haven't seen the newer one. The Devil Made Me Do It or whatever. I haven't seen that one. But this one has to be hands down the best Conjuring movie or Conjuring universe movie that I've seen. This one was hands down just like it got me so enthralled while watching it. I was so invested in the movie. There was even points in time where I was like, heck yeah, like where even I was on the side of the ghosts at some point where I'm like, yeah, like give her back her chair. Yeah. Like I was flip-flopping. Like I was just like, yeah, you better exercise that demon. But then I was also just like, but man, but that demon needs to go and get some scares going on here. Yeah, see what's under that tent. Come on. Yeah, stick your head in there, you goof. Like I was getting enthralled in the movie. I was really enjoying it. And like that was a huge surprise because I'm like, God, all these movies just freaking suck. They're just a snore fest, and I'm so bored out of all these Conjuring movies. And then we end up seeing this one, and I'm just like, man, like why couldn't have all of these other garbagey movies been like this one? Were all these things just trying to make a buck for whatever reason? And like since like it seemed finally someone was like, hey, you know what, I like that Conjuring movie, then all of a sudden they're like, oh well, bam, here's a good story. Why like Annabelle, freaking all those movies for the most point, like they kind of sucked. Like the earliest Annabelle story was maybe good out of maybe those, and but everything else was just straight up just like garbage for the most point. Like I don't know about the Nun. Like the Nun was just kind of an okay thing, as well as probably any number of things. But like I could enjoy the Conjuring movie, so I was just kind of like anticipating and waiting to just like, but this movie needs to just have something that is just to be not a slow to a crawl pace. There was never a downtime moment I feel in this movie where I can't really complain about the story. Um, like this time around, it feels like they kind of gave you a much better payout than they have before because like they don't do these stupid camera angle things where like you have the person here and the camera is like like we don't have that in this movie. Like if anything, there's to be these couple shots where eventually one person is to be there and the camera kind of loops around them and then comes back to that same spot. But that's just kind of build up suspense for when eventually we finally do have that payoff in that one scene. So the stupid circular camera shots that they do in this movie eventually do have a payoff because it's actually just like, oh, okay, is something gonna be at some part of this room? Uh, uh? And then you're like, but then you're like, whoa, something happened. So we do like I think the only also like the only little nitpicking thing that I could say is we do still have to rely on the whole shouting thing to scare people, which I kind of like, considering I've seen so many of these Conjuring movies now, you kind of get used to it. So like I wasn't like at all like I didn't jump at all during the whole scaring parts where they were shouting crap. Where I was just like, oh yeah, I'm so used to that by now. Like you could try to shout me to death, and I'm just like, no. Like if anything, you tried to pull that crap on me before in other stuff where I didn't jump. So now I'm just numb to it. I'm just numb to that yelling garbage that they try to pull in here. But yeah, but overall, just a great Conjuring universe movie. How is it that we went from like freaking like a one, or probably all the Conjuring movies were possibly like a 2 to 3 kind of thing, to like the Conjuring 2 where it's like an 8, as far as like 2 could probably be, or 3 could probably be like, I could stand to maybe watch this movie again if I had to, but I'd rather not, because I'd rather want to watch something better. Whereas this movie, it's like, hey man, I can watch this movie again. I don't care if it's 2 hours and change. I'll watch this movie again because it's actually that good. Even though it's just a jumping point for me to go and watch another Conjuring movie to finish this bad boy up, until they come up with 800 billion other Conjuring movies, because these seem to make money for whatever reason. So definitely check the Conjuring series out. Forget all that other crap. You don't even know. You don't even need to know about any of that other nun whatever stuff. You could probably watch the nun movie before you watch this, but because if you have some time to kill, but I don't feel like you desperately need a connectional thing of whatever to really just, like, you don't need to see Annabelle to understand the Conjuring. Like, because I wouldn't suggest watching Annabelle anyways. But like, there's some stuff where I guess like it could just be a thing in our lives. One of the Conjuring movies does have, or one of the Conjuring movies, one of the Annabelle movies does have the Conjuring people involved in it, so you can watch that for that. But again, it doesn't, like, you can just watch the Conjuring stuff by itself, and you won't need to know anything about any of this stuff. So I think that's a good thing about it. So, uh, so watch The Nun if you want, but you don't have to. Uh, the Conjuring 2 is a way better, so good, you're like, you're invested, you're like hooked, and it's so good. So with that said, let's just go into spoilers, because I've just kind of just been like, yeah, good, yeah, like that's all I have to say, just because like, and it's gonna be quasi complicated to eventually try and notch down all the names in this freaking movie. That's the one thing when you end up having these people in these Conjuring movies that have these big, massive families, and you're like, oh my god! Like now I gotta remember Janet, and I gotta remember 20 other people that is to be with freaking Peggy's family, and like I gotta remember all this rigmarole of of all these names that flowed in and here. So with that just said, let's just go into The Conjuring 2. Netflix and HBO Max currently have this movie, so check it out. Let's just go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we get to spoil this movie. So yeah, very beginning of the film, we are to have the Warrens, both Lorraine and Ed, head to the Amityville horror house. So I'm like, So is all of a sudden we're gonna have an Amityville like Conjuring universe movie? I wouldn't mind that. Like as long as it's good, as long as it's actually as long as it's actually a good film, which I can actually stand to watch. Because a lot of these Conjuring Universal things like Annabelle's and whichever, if they're gonna reboot Annabelle or Annabelle, they should probably just reboot all those other movies. If they're gonna reboot Amityville, like I will be game to eventually see like an Amityville thing put into the Conjuring universe. I think I'll be okay with that. Or just retroactively just wants people to probably go and watch any of the Amityville horror movies, the Ryan Reynolds one at some point, or the Josh Brolin, some guy named Brolin. I don't know. So, but let's go into this. So, we have Ed, we have Lorraine, supposedly with this people that are to be living in this Amityville horror house that are to uh, just ask these people. It's like, well, hey, like, is it possible that there still could quite, or that there might be a demonic presence that is to be in this Amityville house, which was to actually create one of the Defoes going off and killing their entire family here? Like, could there be some kind of presence still lingering also? So, Ed and Lorraine are to kind of tell everybody, like, hey, just close your eyes and hopefully you don't fart, because that might mess up something. No, that was just the 2 cents that I've added. Like, sometimes you're gonna, of course, if you've never been on here before, I'm gonna just have fun with films. I'm gonna like, because there's only so little stuff of which that I just want to have fun with. So I'll be doing that. So because I want to, Lorraine is to go into her other like. I think she's to like almost astro project herself and just kind of make her way into this home to all of a sudden be replaying the killing scenes where she's going through this house and cocking this shotgun and going through and killing the people of the home. All these people are already dead, so like me saying that and the visual of it, like these people are already dead. They've maybe moved on to a new deluxe apartment in the sky. So so Lorraine is just kind of going through and just recreating this whole moment where eventually we have Lorraine and she is talking to this mother, I think, of the Defoes, and she's to say like, "What are you doing? Why did you do this?" And so he ends up, of course, shooting her, and then we end up going and moving into the other rooms where, of course, all the children are to be killed and so on and so forth. So all of a sudden, Lorraine is to eventually just fall over and just start crying. And so Ed is like, "What's going on? Let me, like, should we pull you out?" And Lorraine is like, "No, just give me some time." And so Ed's like, "I think we should pull you out." And Lorraine's like, "No." So, because Lorraine ends up seeing this spirit with these white eyes, this little kid with this white eyes. And so Lorraine wants to go and follow it and see where it goes. So Lorraine is to eventually have this door open. And so all of a sudden, we end up having this nun going and choking Lorraine. And so all of a sudden, she ends up getting pulled out. And so it's like, yeah, like I think there was a presence here. And so all of a sudden, like I think this presence eventually follows both Ed and Lorraine with them, because eventually there's to be this spot where eventually Lorraine is with her daughter in their house, and we just have the nun who's just da 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 just walking around, and so Lorraine eventually follows her because Ed weirdly, I guess, has some kind of sense of some kind of presence also. And so weirdly, he is to eventually paint out this nun. And it looks just like what Lorraine had seen choking her. So it's like, okay, so maybe Ed is having some kind of thing going on with him too, where like maybe he is to just be kind of like having some kind of visuals or visions or something of some kind, like not like in the range of Lorraine, but I don't know. He just has this kind of like radar of sorts, so that's just kind of really interesting. So Ed makes this portrait perfectly of this nun, and so Lorraine is like, "Oh my god!" Like, okay, this is getting too weird. And so Rain tells Ed, "It's like, you know what? How about we stop taking cases for a while, uh, because this is going too far." And Ed is just like, "Well, but we need to go and help people. That's it's the right thing to do." And Lorraine is like, "Yeah, but like we need to just back off because like we're gonna bite off more than we're gonna chew here, and like some stuff is just kind of lingering on us, and we're gonna have to just pull back a little bit." And so Ed is like, "Okay, all right." So Lorraine ends up going and following this nun, and that takes her into the room where Ed has this portrait. And so Lorraine is just kind of looking through this room and just kind of like, okay, where is this? Where is this spirit? Where's the nun? So all of a sudden, we end up seeing this nun shadow that all of a sudden is just start to go around the room, and I'm like, okay, what's going on here? And then all of a sudden, we end up having the nun who all of a sudden is to put her fingers around this portrait and then like lift up the portrait and then run with it, and you can kind of see the portrait and her like face and her like mouth and eyes or whatever moving through the portrait and just scaring Lorraine to where all of a sudden the nun spirit is to seemingly vanish. The portrait is back upon the wall, and I was like, wow, that was honestly just so cool. But I wanted to just kind of get that out, even though it doesn't perfectly in line with the way the exact movie goes into. It's just the version that I like to go into it. So let's back. So now that we have that covered, so now let's get to the Hoshins, the kids and the family and the stuff. You know what I'm saying? So we end up having this other family that is to, of course, be the case of this movie. So we have these kids coming from school, maybe to like I want to say that this is like Christmas break, but I'm not quite sure how long this Christmas break is, because whatever. Anyways, so we end up having this group of kids. We end up having Janet with her one friend who is to give her this Ouija board, and evidently is to also give her this cigarette. Janet is tempted to smoke, but eventually she ends up not going along with it. All of a sudden, her teacher is to spot these girls lighting a cigarette, and she's like, "Hey, kids, like, what are you doing?" And so they end up being scared off, and then the teacher ends up just taking the cigarette. Oh, yeah, I'm old enough. And then she just takes the cigarette out. I'm like, maybe she should be like, "Yeah, kids, yeah, I can smoke, you can't, yeah." So, so anyway, school is out. So we have, of course, I believe Billy, who is to seemingly be a kid who is to stutter, and so kids are to make fun of him. And so eventually, when school is to get out, we have like Margaret and Janet and all the kind of the kids are all to eventually go all home together and just kind of walk off as basically Billy is to get kind of bullied on, but eventually they're like, "Hey man, Billy, like just think nothing of it. Just man, like whatever." So and eventually Billy's like, "Okay." So they all head home. So really we have it to where it seems like Peggy who is to be the mother here is to really just be like struggling to make ends meet, to where really the treat or the real true nice thing that they are to do for the kids is just to kind of give them um the god, what is the word, the 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 bread, the little bread, the little god, the little bread things. I don't know what they're called. I'll probably, for some reason, it's just not computing in my head right now. But eventually you'll probably get there. I think it starts with a B, but I'm not sure. Uh, anyways, so pushing on. So uh, it's not breadsticks. It's like the god pushing on. It doesn't matter. So uh, it's not like bagels, but it's like the little whatever it's pushing on. Um, I don't know why I can't think of it. So, anyways, pushing on. So, eventually we end up having these kids who are to all. Uh, we find out that eventually it seems that this family's father had ran out on them and had left with some woman across the street or down the street or something. And so this guy is gone and he's never coming back. So eventually what ends up happening is we end up having Jeanette and Margaret, who eventually are to go and play with this Ouija board, and eventually they're asking the spirits if there's anybody there that'll talk to them. And Janet was to mention that supposedly her and her friend had gone and spoken to spirits once before, and it's been really interesting. So both Margaret and Janet try to speak to spirits, and nothing happens. And so, and Janet was asking eventually the spirits if their father was ever going to come back, and there wasn't any response of that, which is kind of sad. So eventually, Janet goes and chucks this supposed Ouija board under this bed, and so now we have some just kind of interesting spots with eventually a kind of like recliner looking thing in this movie, where eventually there's to be this spot where eventually like the recliner is just kind of like moving, or eventually there's the whole like remote scene, which I thought was really interesting. But we'll get to all that. So uh, I'm trying to perfectly like figure out all these scenes. Uh, so the first one, it's the first kind of showcasing of this spirit thing, is to eventually when all the kids are to go off to bed, we end up having Billy, who is to eventually go and I think go and get something to drink, and then he decides to excuse me. Then he decides to eventually toss a toy back into this tent, which he ends up kind of hanging out in. And it seemed that they also had sang that whole like Crooked Man song, where eventually they kind of play this little device and see this little Crooked Man thing kind of spin and whatever, and they end up singing this song. So, and kind of find out like Billy doesn't have his stutter when eventually he is to kind of sing this song. So Billy is to go and get something to drink and then put his toy back into this tent. And so he ends up going back to bed. All of a sudden, we end up finding out that this fire truck toy is to all of a sudden make it back to Billy. And so Billy is like, okay, this is weird. So Billy then goes on and chucks the toy back into the tent to have the tent go and chuck it back at Billy. And so eventually Billy's like, what the heck? What's in there? And so all of a sudden, this tent is to shout at Billy, like, get out. And so Billy's like, okay, all right, I'm just gonna go back in my room and just. So, uh, so now we have also where I guess Janet is to go off one night and I guess to maybe go to the bathroom or something in the middle of the night. And so all of a sudden, Margaret is to wake up because she keeps hearing this knocking on her door. And so Margaret is to open the door to like, what the heck? So all of a sudden, Margaret ends up seeing Janet come back in the room, and Margaret's like, hey, like, why did you knock on the door? And Janet's like, I didn't do that. What are you even talking about? So all of a sudden, we end up having Janet who is having nightmares, so much so that it kind of wakes up Margaret. And so, like, Janet is all of a sudden, like, talking in her sleep. And so Margaret is like, hey, Janet, wake up. You're having a horrible nightmare. And so all of a sudden, when eventually Janet does wake up, all of a sudden, like, she is, like, talking to herself and, like, answering herself. And Margaret's like, okay, this is seemingly getting a little weird. So all of a sudden, like, Janet is having this conversation. And so all of a sudden, like Margaret is just to kind of like ignore it or whatever, but then all of a sudden like like Janet is to like appear like in front of Margaret to just kind of like, whoa, like, all right, like, okay, this is interesting. So eventually this starts to uh escalate. Janet all of a sudden is starting to sleepwalk, and Peggy is to eventually find her. And Janet's like, "Oh, I must have been sleepwalking again." And Peggy's like, "Again? Like there was an again that you were sleepwalking? This seems weird." So all of a sudden, Janet is to tie herself with some kind of jump rope thing to her bed, so that way, if there's ever to be a time where she's to sleepwalk, she'll probably wake up. So we end up having this moment where like Janet is to go to sleep, and all of a sudden she ends up getting yanked and freaking falls on the floor because she of course started to sleepwalk, and then the rope kind of kept her there. So all of a sudden now we have Janet who has this rope, and she's roping herself to this bed consistently, to where eventually Peggy is to tell Janet, it's like, well, hey, like, maybe you shouldn't like tie yourself to. And Janet's like, I just want to make sure that I'm always just like, that I'm not gonna just wander off or whatever, because Janet's starting to get a little scared. So eventually the actual escalation of all this, and how we start to get like concerned or worried or whatever, like we uh let's get to the TV moment, because the TV moment is really interesting. So Janet all of a sudden is to be sitting and watching TV, and so all of a sudden we end up having uh like Janet watching TV, and all of a sudden the channels are being changed. And Janet's like, okay, what's going on? Like, anybody pulling a prank on me? Where's like another remote for this TV? So Janet starts adjusting back to where she was watching. And then the channel goes and adjusts back to whatever the ghosts might have been wanting to watch. So, uh, like we also, when Jenna was talking to supposedly Billy before, basically everything that the ghost is to say, that these people are to be trespassing and that he wants them out. And so Janet is to just kind of talk back to this entity and just like, well, hey, like, you should get out. You don't belong here. So Janet is to, again, back and forth with this ghost, flipping through these channels. And so all of a sudden, Janet is to again turn to where the remote is to find the remote gone, and all of a sudden the remote is to be on the reclining chair. All of a sudden, floating in midair, and then it drops. Like, okay, that's interesting. So eventually, like, Janet goes closely to the TV to, I guess, adjust the channel on the TV to all of a sudden have this old man who is to be Billy, who is to be yelling, "Get out!" And then, like, we have Janet who's like, "Okay, this is getting a little crazy." So, all of this finally comes to a real legitimate, like, where even Peggy is to realize something is wonky going on, where eventually there is to be a problem with Margaret and Janet, and so Peggy is to rush in because these characters are, of course, getting really, really scared. So Peggy ends up going into the room to because no wait, let's back this up a little bit. So I think this is the night with the chair, which I love the chair. So uh, I think Margaret and Janet are sleeping, and so I think there's to be like a knock or something at the door. So Janet goes and opens the door, and then is to eventually get so scared that she ends up putting a chair against the door and then going into bed. So immediately when she ends up going into bed, she ends up going and turning the other side to find the chair right next to her bed, and the door is now open to where this creature is going to eventually come to get her. And so now eventually Janet is screaming her head off for her mother. Her mother comes rushing in, and all of a sudden, like, she ends up closing the door to eventually all of a sudden have this drawer or this dresser all of a sudden going flying in front of the door. And so Peggy's like, oh my god, there's something goofy about this. There's somebody inside my house. Like, I'm gonna have to go and call the police to figure this whole thing out. So uh because we end up having to where Janet ends up going, and I think that's when she has like the mark on her neck, like that she was bitten, and no one else in this family is to have that kind of bite mark. And because eventually Janet goes and tries to put the sheets over her head, has this flashlight on, and like the thing is trying to get her, the Billy is trying to get her. So eventually we get to where these police are to eventually check this house out. And so all of a sudden we eventually have them within this house start to see furniture move out of nowhere. There's certain chairs that all of a sudden go from one room to back into the kitchen, as if this like ghost wants like this house neat and tidy and whatever, to where everything is all of a sudden moving in this house, and to where the police are just like, okay. So yeah, we're just gonna file a report, but there's really nothing we can do about this. And so the police are just like, well, hey, like, I'm gonna go and talk to this pastor, and I'm just gonna go and like and tell him about this. And maybe he's gonna come up with some kind of thing that he can do. So all of a sudden, this comes down to the pastor, and so now all of a sudden, this like starts to become this TV like thing that all of a sudden, like, news reporters and stuff are trying to cover this whole thing. And speaking of going on TV, we end up having Ed and Lorraine going on to this TV thing where we have this guy who is to be kind of like Walter Pecking, both Ed and Lorraine. If you guys remember Ghostbusters, where you end up having the Walter Peck character who is to basically just say like that the Ghostbusters are just guys who are to put on a show, some light show or something to uh, like there to be con artists, and I want to expose them for the mockery and the real ridiculousness that they are. We end up having one of those guys on this show trying to dispel these people and to say like, oh no, they're not really who they are. They're just these swindlers and whoever. And so we end up having this guy, and I'm trying to see if there's a name anywhere. I probably don't even want to take this time. No, couldn't quickly find it. Anyways, so they end up going on this show, which I think is Anita Gregory's show, maybe possibly. Anyways, so all of a sudden Ed is to all of a sudden get really just upset with this guy and frustrated that he is to basically just call these people like that they're God, is it like snake oil salesman or something like that. And so Ed just gets so upset that he starts arguing with this guy on the show. And so after the show is done taping, Ed is to get like so just like still upset about this guy, and Lorraine is like, you know what, like just like count to 10, and it's like, yeah, I'm gonna count to 10. Like, but it's like, but so, uh, but I guess that's like the good thing about them, because they're just so passionate about this, and they just so die-hardingly believe that what they're doing is the honest to God truth. So now we eventually have, of course, eventually Ed and Lorraine getting told about this case. And so Lorraine is to go and hear this from this father about this case, and it's like, hey, like, if anything, you guys can go there and just be kind of people who can report back to us to kind of see if this is a true, legitimate case or not. You guys don't have to actually deal with it yourselves. Just kind of be the watchers of this kind of case. Just kind of see if this could be legit or not. Like, you don't have to do anything past that, because Lorraine is just to be like really just say, hey, we need some time. We need some time away. Like, this is getting too much. So Lorraine is just be like, no, let's not take this case. And Ed is just like, well, but you know, we could just help another person. So eventually they head to this home. And so, because evidently there is some possibility that there's a legitimate case here, because we end up having this guy named Morris Gross, who is to, I guess, do some kind of they had mics there, but I'm not quite sure it's televised or whatever, but they supposedly end up talking with the Billy spirit through Janet, because now like this thing has really gone on to possess Janet and is now like talking through her. And so we have Morris, who is to kind of just hear what Billy is to just kind of say and kind of tell us his story. And so they're just like, okay, this is interesting. So we also have Morris, who is to start to eventually document certain kind of cases, that there could quite possibly be something there, but really it's just through like photos. And so would eventually both Ed and Lorraine eventually meet Morris and just kind of go through this stuff. They're just like, you know what, there isn't much of anything really concrete 100% here. We have to go in further and have like actual like cameras being like put into the house, and like really we really need to eventually have like legit like something here. So eventually Peggy and her family eventually are to have scrambled after the whole police incident Like they end up going and scrambling to their neighbor's house, but eventually this thing kind of follows them everywhere. So eventually the crooked man like follows them everywhere, because eventually we end up having a moment where like this whole entire family is all like sleeping in one room, and so all of a sudden these neighbors are to eventually have um, this dog that ends up, when you ring this bell, like the dog needs to go pee, it needs to go outside because it really needs to go to the crapper. So we end up having this one kid who ends up getting up because he ends up hearing the dingling of the dog. So all of a sudden this kid goes out and is like okay pooch, like go out and just do your business. And so all of a sudden this pooch, this dog, is to all of a sudden turn from this dog to all of a sudden the crooked man, and he's starting to go after this kid, and they're like, oh my god, this is awesome, this is so cool. And then eventually it seems like wherever this family is going to go, like we just have this spirit thing that's eventually going to go after them. And we also end up having this one moment where eventually Janet was to be possessed by this thing, and she ends up going and flinging this thing at this like armoire. And like when the guy in the house just kind of wakes up and is like, hey, what's going on, because everybody's screaming. And so all of a sudden like Janet ends up using her like weird ghostly ability to go and fling something, just scare the crap out of these people. So so now the Warrens are being involved in this story, and they are going into this house to eventually try to figure things out. Weirdly, weirdly, Lorraine, like, excuse me, isn't getting any vibes from this house like she would normally. It seems like there's something nerfing her ability, or there's something just like it doesn't feel quite right. Um, it seems like the ghosts are getting smarter. Weirdly enough, or the demons, the ghosts, the whatever. I think it's it seems one of the same, but so, but we end up having this really nice moment where eventually Lorraine is to talk to Janet when they get to this house. And so Lorraine is to be like, hey, you know what? Like, because like Janet is to start to like really just be so like sad and depressed because like none of her friends want to be around her anymore because they are kind of treating Janet like a leper, uh, because of like all this stuff that's kind of going on with her. And so Janet's like, yeah, I lost all my friends. Like I've like everyone hates me. And so Lorraine is like, well, yeah, like I too was an outcast once, and like it took me a while to find anybody. Um, but you know what? When eventually I found that one person, you know what I did? And Jana was like, what? She's like, I married him. It kind of feels like we have had that story once before, but it still just feels just kind of funny to just consistently bring that up. We also had this one other moment where Janet was to eventually go and talk to Ed, and Ed had this one story about him having this cross on his neck, and how he eventually got this cross because there was to be this one time where Ed was to be uh, having a monster actually underneath Ed's bed. And so at one point, this monster tried to pull Ed underneath this bed. And so Ed scrambled and went to his father, and his father was like, no, like you go back into your room and you face your fears. To where eventually then Ed turned around and found a cross and was to eventually tell this monster, it's like, hey, uh like monster, you better get out of here or God is gonna beat the heck out of you. And so the monster ended up going away, and so Ed is like, yeah, it's like uh, and basically after that time, like eventually I found someone who could have really just believed that story. And you know what I did with that person? And Janet's like, you married her? And it's like, I think you knew that. I think there was something that you knew about that story. And Janet's like, seems like you guys use that story quite often, but it always works. It always is a fun thing. Um, so, uh, so we really kind of like when the Warrens are to eventually go through this house, it's kind of a very slow pace for them to really get any furniture moving or any things or whatever. Really, just Peggy or like any of the number of the people in the house are just kind of telling these people of these stories. And so the Warrens are just like, okay, but like we haven't seen anything yet. There isn't any proof. So what they decide to do is they end up going and having this tape recording, and so they're like, "Hey, Spirit, let's have a chat. Let's speak this out. Let's come on, whatever you want to say here, bring it on down." Uh, they have Janet and they have Janet drinking this, or not drinking, but holding this water in her mouth. Um, so that way there isn't some kind of ventriloquist act going on here. So Janet is who eventually spit the water out because evidently the spirit is to say that Billy is, I guess, a little like group shy to come out. And it's like, okay. So everyone is to turn around, and so all of a sudden Billy is to start to be pretty chatty. So Ed goes on and he is to talk to Billy and or Billy. I'm just gonna keep saying Billy. I don't know if it's the right term or word or whatever. Anyways, evidently it's Bill. Oh well. Bill Wilkins. Anyways, so Ed talks to Bill, and so we have Ed who is basically just say it's like, well, hey, like, why aren't you moving on? Like, isn't heaven a great place? Like, and Bill is just like, well, I don't think that I'm gonna be a heaven guy, and Ed's like, well, how do you know that? Like, are you sure? Like, and so eventually Ed is to bust out his cross and just be like, well, hey, like, maybe eventually I'm just gonna have to persuade you to eventually leave this house because like you don't live here anymore. Um, like all the people that have lived here that you have lived with have all gone on and died, so you should too. So eventually Ed is to leave, and so Janet is to spit out this water. So they're just like, okay, well, like that isn't exactly proof. Like we need something, and so eventually they're just kind of really just waiting it out. They're just kind of like, and so Ed is at some point thinking that maybe uh, there is some kind of rational reason for what uh, Janet is going through. Like Ed is talking to Lorraine and saying like, well, maybe she has like, maybe she's schizophrenic. Maybe she has multiple personalities. Maybe this is something like mentally health related, and it's not actually a possession of sorts. So eventually we get to a point here where uh, eventually Janet is to be taken in by this entity again, while Ed and both Ed and Lorraine are to be there. So what ends up happening is we have uh, this point when Bill is to go and grab Janet and to drag her into this room. Coincidentally, the door is to be locked from the out from the it, from the out the outside of where they desperately need to go and grab this key. So they end up grabbing this key, unlocking this door. All of a sudden, to just see that Janet just be like suffocated by this curtain, and so like Peggy was to have seen uh, Bill's face, but like again, like we have just Ed and Lorraine who are just like, well, like we didn't see anything, so like we can't really say that this is true or not. So now we push on to eventually have Janet, who uh, no wait, one of the kids is to eventually go and kind of hear this Billy character. And so Ed is to tell all the kids, like, hey, like, stand up against this monster. Like, if anything, uh, you need to protect your sister and kind of like just go together and all just try to just like scare this thing away, like power in numbers kind of thing. So one of the kids, who's a little pimp, just decides he's like, I'm gonna go off and I'm gonna face this monster and I'm gonna just stare it down and just get it away from here because this has gone on far too long. So this kid goes into the kitchen where all of a sudden all these knives are just on this kitchen freaking door. But this kid is like, you know what? I'm just gonna be in this freaking room. Whatever. I'm gonna face this thing. So all of a sudden we end up having Janet like going and almost attacking her own brother because she's possessed by this demonic thing. Uh, we end up having Ed and Lorraine kind of making their way to try to make it to this kitchen to eventually have like this one chair come flying at them for whatever reason. So when they eventually do make it into the kitchen, like this kitchen is thrashed. Like this kitchen is all over the gosh darn place. And so all of a sudden they're thinking like, well, hey, this has to be legit. How could this kid do all of this stuff? And so all of a sudden Nita is to go and tell these people this is fake. I have proof. So they go and they watch this camera feed to find out that evidently Janet had gone and done all this stuff in this kitchen, flinging all this stuff, going and tossing and bending spoons and whatever. And so they're like, like, so this does look fake. So we're just going to have to go and we're going to pull the plug on this because there must be just something mentally wrong with her. This isn't a real legitimate possession, and so on and so forth. Let's just get the heck out of here. Let's go on a train back to our homes. Let's just call it a day. So all of a sudden, Ed and Lorraine are making it onto this train, and so all of a sudden Ed is to go and drop his cassettes. Or his little recording device dealios. So Ed is to think about something. He's like, wait a minute. Like, maybe there's something that I was missing here. Because eventually Ed was to eventually find Janet kind of stuck in this little spot where Janet was like mumbling something. And then Ed was to eventually pull Janet out of this place. And so the one guy was asking, how did she get in that little small crevice of a place? Because she's been teleporting. Because there was to be the one spot where Lorraine had went through the wall of her bedroom to be down a floor. And so now she's just stuck on this wall, which Ed and Lorraine didn't see this, but Janet is to be kind of on the ceiling, and so Bill is just kind of rocking back and forth in this chair, just like, like, yeah. So, and so Janet is desperately calling for help. Peggy goes into the room to see like the rope just into the floor, and so like Peggy tries to go to where Janet is, uh, to eventually have her just kind of freaking all over the gosh darn place. Uh, I think she ends up going back into the actual room, but it's so goofy. So, and I just wanted to cover that little scene or whatever because like we're kind of getting towards the nitty gritty end here. So back at the train, so Ed is to go and record and have both of these recordings going on at the same time, and so all of a sudden we end up finding out that Bill is to say that there is something else that he is to be afraid of, and he wants it to kind of go away, not these people. Like he wants this other thing to kind of let him go so he can go off to the great beyond or whatever, because it's kind of like keeping him here, it's kind of straining him here. So Ed and Lorraine, like Ed is starting to realize, like, okay, there has to be something more here than just Bill and the Crooked Man. There has to be something else that is kind of locking these things down here. So Lorraine also at some point was to be sketching these letters into her Bible when she was to have that time with her and this nun in a part of this movie. So they are to go now and kind of rush to make it back to this house because Lorraine and Ed are thinking like, dude, we have to get there as quickly as possible because Janet is going to die soon if we don't get uh, to her and just kind of like try to help her as quickly as possible. So all of a sudden now we have Janet who's to be like freaking yellow eyed and like freaking demonic as all F. And to where now like all the families like freaking outside and they're just like, dude, like this girl is just like some Linda Blair shit going on. So Ed and Lorraine make it out there, and so uh Ed is trying to like bash his way into the door, but it won't budge. So eventually, Ed is to crash through this window and try to make it through the window to all of a sudden have this couch be forced right in front of the window to where Ed can't make it into the house. So he's like, "Fuh." So he goes and he turns into the back of the house, and so he makes it through the door, but Lorraine can't make it through the door. So Lorraine is forcing this guy to eventually kind of chop down this door for eventually Lorraine to squeak through, but then he can't. So Ed is to go through this basement where it's to be flooded, and let's put a pin in that because like Ed had wanted to go and help Peggy because her place was to be flooded. And so he was like, okay, like I see the problem here, and so I'm going to help you out. So Peggy goes with this light to just kind of shine where Ed is so that way he can go and fix this pipe. All of a sudden, there's to be this entity kind of slowly but surely uh, coming to Ed, and I guess it's Bill, and so Peggy is to realize this, and so Ed Peggy's to tell Ed, "Hey, there's something behind you." Ed looks, sees nothing. All of a sudden, Peggy is to be grabbed by Bill, bitten in the arm, and so Ed is to make his way back to Peggy to see that she has a bite mark on her arm. And so Ed all of a sudden finds these dentures and he's like, oh, they match. They weirdly match Peggy's mark there. So it's like, So like they still could just write that off as there not really truly being a case here. Like that eventually they might have found the dentures that match this whole thing. But so uh So now Ed's in the basement, and so Lorraine is telling Ed, like, hey, don't go on without me. Because Lorraine tells Ed about the vision that she had about him dying. And so Ed, now knowing that, is still just going to go off and do what he needs to, anyways, because, like, he is to just, like, hey, I'm, like we need to help these people. Like, like, we have to do this. And so Ed goes off to go and help this girl, and Lorraine is to like, hey, he's probably gonna die. Like, it seems we have these moments just really built up to lead to where, okay, when is Ed going to die? Sadly enough, uh, Lorraine is to be outside, and all of a sudden there's to be this tree that is to be hit by lightning perfectly to create some kind of tree-like spike, and it's like, oh my god, like here is quite possibly how Ed could actually die. So Ed goes and uses this pipe to make it through this house, and he kind of climbs through this house um, to all of a sudden get hit with this steam in the eyes, to where all of a sudden Ed is now blind, or just his eyes are just really heavily blurry. And so now Ed is like trying to make it through the house with this like cross, and when he is to just kind of see something or kind of feel like there's a sense around him, he is to just kind of start kind of muttering some kind of like protectional thing to scare away this spirit. Um, so eventually, the rain is to eventually have the guy like chop through this door. So Lorraine makes it through, does the same thing that Ed does, and so she is to just kind of make it through the house, trying to figure out where Ed is. So Ed all of a sudden is to hear something by this tent, and so Ed goes and sees the little spinning toy, and so he sticks his head in there to see this crooked man like in the tent with him, and so he like freaking backs away to all of a sudden have this crooked man who is trying to attack Ed, and so Ed ends up closing this door on the crooked man, and the crooked man ends up like having this hook trying to get at Ed. Um, Oh, like I also forgot about the moment where eventually Janet was to go into this room, and like her room, and all the room was to be covered with these crosses, because evidently there was a bunch of people that donated all of their crosses to Peggy, and Peggy kept putting it all the crosses into this room. And we get the one moment where Janet was to be in the room, and all these crosses were to be forcibly turned around. And so when Ed and Lorraine go into the room, they Lorraine ends up kind of seeing weirdly this cross turned back around. So she's like, okay, that's weird, but she couldn't make a clear consensus of it. When um, eventually Janet was to be kind of taking that curtain and to be choked, that's when all the crosses start to turn around, to turn upside down. So Ed and Janet are to be in this room. So all of a sudden, the possessed Janet is to go and break through this window, and is going to jump off this window to basically fall on this tree. And Ed catches her at the last second, and then is holding on to this curtain. So Lorraine makes her way to where Ed is, and is to try and help Ed, but all of a sudden the nun is to arrive, and is to basically just stop Lorraine in her tracks and kind of smash her up against this wall. And so before we get to this point, both Ed and Lorraine were having this conversation before they were to get here, where Lorraine, after that recording, had finally gotten a vision and was talking to Bill, and he was just speaking in this riddle. And so she ends up starting to go and mention this riddle to Ed, and the answer of the riddle was to be a name, that we need to figure out the spirit's name. So eventually Lorraine goes back to her Bible because she knows the name of the nun, and she's thinking the nun is the spirit that is to be causing all, excuse me, is to be the one causing all of this. And so Lorraine luckily is to have known what the name of the nun is. It is Valak. So the nun is stopping Lorraine from uh, getting to Ed, and so now Lorraine is to now say, like, I know who you are, Valak. And so she ended up starting to like just say like kind of all these things to eventually banish Valak the nun away. Uh, and so once this nun is to vanish away, Lorraine is to grab Ed, and it seems that finally all of the smoke is cleared. Both Bill and the crooked man have vanished, and it seems, and so now we end up having it to where it's kind of like the happy ending of it all, where eventually it seems uh, we have Lorraine and Ed like hey guys, we did it. We closed another case. So we have Ed at one point trying to make this family happier and trying to put music back into their life because supposedly their Peggy's ex-husband took all their music from them. So Ed at one point was to go and get this record of Elvis to just have them listen to this music. So sadly enough, the record player wasn't working. So Ed goes on and is like, well, I'm just going to perform some Elvis for you. I'm going to sing a song and we're all going to sing along and just, like, this will have to just be good enough. So Ed starts singing this song, and so everybody's to just kind of feel a little bit, like, better, like, morale is kind of, like, gotten better. Even, like, Janet is actually smiling for once. So when Ed and Lorraine go back home, Lorraine is to replay that song yet again, and both Ed and Lorraine are just kind of dancing, and that's how kind of the movie is to just send off. And so they end up having this like slow to a crawl, kind of telling us kind of what happened with all these characters, and like yeah, interesting movie. Really enjoyed it, but I'm also gonna get the heck out of here. If there's anything that I kind of missed as far detail wise, because there's a lot of compact stuff here. There's a lot of stuff that I might have missed about or skipped about or whatever, or I didn't go into heavy detail. But that's bound to happen. There's a lot of stuff to talk about in this movie. But other than that, I think I'm gonna get the heck out of here because I spent like an hour talking about this movie, and it's 2 hours long. So with that said, I hope that I covered everything. It's the always like kind of backpedaling or backtracking, just like I had to go through in a very roundabout way talking about this movie. So if people don't like that, oh well, I did the best I could. Um, Especially going and talking about this movie because there's always in these Conjuring movies, there's a lot of like same scenes kind of going on. Plus, this one had a lot of stuff into it. There's a lot of stuff. We also talked. Lorraine and Morris were to talk about like how at one point he was like, yeah, like if there's really possession going on here, like this is to be really great. And Lorraine is like, well, that's a weird way to look about things. And like Morris is just like, no, like I don't think you understand like what I'm trying to do here. I'm not to try to get in the history books. like Maurice has mentioned that he had lost a family member, and so he's just kind of hoping that maybe if they prove that there is a possession here, that he can like maybe know that maybe his family member who had died uh, was to be maybe possibly like still around or probably going off to a better place. Uh, yeah, I think that's all it. And yeah, so with that said, I'm gonna get the heck out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.